and KEMC in Billings, Montana.
That's Karen Brock of Lawrence, Kansas. Thank you so much for playing the puzzle.
Oh, thank you both.
All right, Will, what is next week's challenge?
Yeah, it's a tough one from listener Joe Becker of Palo Alto, California. The zh sound can be spelled in many different ways in English, like the S in measure, like the G in beige, like the Z in azure, like the J in Maharaja, and like the X in luxury, as some people pronounce it. The ZH sound can also be spelled as a T in one instance. We know of only one common word that this is true of, not counting its derivatives. What word is it? So again, what is the only common English word in which the zh sound is spelled with a T?
Okay, when you have the answer, go to our website, npr.org/puzzle, and click on the Submit Your Answer link. Remember, just one entry, please. Our deadline for entries this week is Thursday, May 4th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Don't forget to include a phone number where we can reach you. If you're the winner, we'll give you a call, and if you pick up the phone, you'll get to play on the air with the puzzle editor of the New York Times and puzzle master of Weekend Edition, Will Shorts. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Aisha.
Linear TV is making a comeback, but this time via streaming. Tubi and Pluto TV are among the free streaming services that allow you to turn on a channel online with ads. Want to watch reruns of a classic show?
Beam me up, Mr. Spock.
Yes, there is a Star Trek channel. And there's a bunch of other shows and movies as well. Here to break it down for us is Dade Hayes, business editor at Deadline Hollywood. Welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
These streaming services are called free ad-supported streaming television, or FAST for short. Tell me a little bit about them and their offerings, because it sounds a little bit to me like this thing we used to have, which was like broadcast TV, where you would like turn on the TV and there were ads, and that's how that worked.
You're definitely on the right page with that. I mean, I think it's a mix of the old school broadcast rabbit ears TV experience and the way cable turned it into a bigger menu of options. And this is all taking place in the digital environment. So imagine how many websites there are out there, how many social media, pages there are out there. It's just as targeted and sliced and diced as that kind of world.
What sets the big streamers like Tubi, Pluto TV, and like Roku channel apart from each other?
There's different emphasis on live, linear style programming and on demand. Like Tubi is much more of a library on demand experience where you poke around or something is there and you search for it and you call it up and you watch it. Pluto is a lot more of a lean back. There's an on-screen programming guide where you can channel surf and do a lot of the stuff that we're all, some of us have been accustomed to doing for decades, with traditional TV. And then there's a few services. Local Now is one. Amazon Fire TV is another, that have kind of a different orientation, whether it's Local Now has a lot of local TV stations on it. Fire TV lets you search by genre, sports, cooking, travel, different kind of things that you're looking for.
And the big thing about this is that you don't need a subscription to Tubi and Pluto TV and these other things. You can just get on them, right?
They're absolutely free. And in fact, they're really kind of designed for that unboxing of a smart TV set. That's why Samsung and Vizio and LG and all the, TV makers also are deeply invested in FAST, because they want you to bring the set home, plug it in, and as long as you've got an internet connection, you can jump on these FAST channels without a pay TV subscription. The system is losing 5-6 million pay TV subscriptions every year. People are cutting the cord. Now, it's not quite equivalent to cable TV or the pay TV package that you're leaving behind, but you don't need to pay anything. These are wide open and free, and that's what they're sort of experimenting with.
How are these services influencing traditional streaming like Netflix? Because this is, kind of crowding the market now, right?
It's keeping everybody on their toes. And, some of those subscription services, like I'm thinking of Peacock, took Fast into account when they launched. They have a whole sort of vertical within Peacock that is a Fast lane, if you will. It's like this area of Peacock that is Fast channels. So you're starting to see more of that as we go. And, my prediction is that as advertising becomes a lot more common in streaming, Netflix and Disney just launched ad services last fall. You're going to see more Fast included in the mix. I think it's just going to be a type of streaming that's appealing to a certain consumer that's going to end up taking up more real estate overall.
That's Dade Hayes, business editor at Deadline Hollywood. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Oh.
In 1959, playwright Lorraine Hansberry rocketed to stardom with A Raisin in the Sun. 5 years later, she had another Broadway production, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. That show has rarely been revived, but it's back now. It opened last week with a celebrity cast, including Oscar Isaac of Star Wars fame. Jeff London reports.
Let's address the elephant in the room. Writing A Raisin in the Sun was both a blessing and a curse for its young black playwright, says Joy Gresham, director of the Lorraine Hansberry Literary Trust.
She was like the it girl coming out of A Raisin in the Sun.
That play, which realistically depicted a black family in Chicago, took Broadway by storm, became a popular film, and has subsequently become part of high school curriculums. But when The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, a critique of white liberalism that takes place in Greenwich Village, debuted in 1964, critics were not as enamored.
There was a real resistance and intolerance of it, a resentment. She left her lane. And there's always this tone of, who does she think she is?
Yet Hansberry was writing from personal experience. She lived among the artists, intellectuals, and social activists in Greenwich Village. Unfortunately, the play that opened on Broadway was unfinished because Hansberry was dying of cancer. And while she did rewrites from a hotel room across the street from the theater, she was too ill to attend rehearsals and previews. Just a few months after it opened, the 34-year-old playwright died, and the play closed.
It's wild and it's messy and imperfect, but incredibly powerful.
Film and theater star Oscar Isaac plays Sidney Brustein, the intellectual whose life and marriage unravel over the course of the evening. He says messiness is one of the play's virtues.
The wildness of it and at times the incoherent way that the motivations or seemingly lack of motivation occurs with the characters that feels so true to life.
I couldn't believe it. That you should love me. I felt I was the luckiest girl in the world.
What do you mean, was?
Please, I'm trying to tell you something.
I'm trying to listen.
Try harder.
Hansberry's personal life was certainly complicated. While she was married to Robert Nemiroff, a white man who was a close collaborator and became her literary executor, she had several long-term relationships with women. Director Ann Kaufman says the topics in The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window feel relevant in 2023, maybe even more so than when it was written.
We really don't know which way is up with race politics, with culture, with social issues, with what it is to be human these days. And who should we listen to at this moment but Lorraine Hansberry, who was prescient, and I feel like we're still catching up with her.
Kaufman says the play is a call to activism, and its characters are caught between cynicism and hope in a chaotic world. Oscar Isaac says he's struck by an exchange Sidney has with another character in the play.
She says, you can't expect people to change like that. And he says, the world's about to crack right down the middle. We have to change or fall into the crack.
One of the things I really appreciate about Lorraine is her embrace of small change as powerful change.
Rachel Brosnahan plays Iris, a would-be actress who's engaged in a struggle to find her own identity and independence from her strong-willed husband.
Because unlike a lot of other plays, there's not such a clear beginning, middle, and end to their journeys. It's really jagged.
If the characters are in flux, the script has been too. In creating an acting version for the Broadway production, literary executor Joy Gresham collaborated with director Anne Kaufman, looking at the 4 different published versions of the script, as well as Hansberry's notes and drafts in Harlem's Schomburg Center for Research and Culture.
We've kind of landed in this incredible creative method, talking to one another, listening to Lorraine, listening to these different versions, and trying to imagine where she would have gone with it.
So, is this the final version of the sign in Sidney Brustein's window? Only time will tell. Rachel Brosnahan says there's one moment in the play she finds particularly touching, since it reflects Lorraine Hansberry's too short life.
I think about it all the time. I mean, the line is, I am 29, and I want to begin to know that when I die, more than 10 or 100 people will know the difference. I want to make it. It's beautiful, and I can't help but think about Lorraine. It's really moving.
For NPR News, I'm Jeff London in New York.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. BJ Liederman writes our theme music. I'm Aisha Roscoe.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Cunard, sailing the transatlantic crossing between New York and London on Queen Mary 2, with a commitment to White Star service, fine dining, and entertainment. Cunard.com/crossing. From Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security. More information is available online at carnegie.org. And from the Doris Duke Foundation.
This is 91.3 WLRN and HD1 Miami Fort Lauderdale, 91.5 WKWM and HD1 Marathon Key West, 105.5 WOLL HD2 Hope Sound, and 101.9 NPR for the Palm Beaches.
We know kindness is a good thing. So when we think of doing something nice for someone, why do we so often hold back?
I'm not the first person to suggest that being kind to other people improves well-being, and yet we have tons of opportunities to be kind to other people that we don't take advantage of.
Breaking through the barriers to kindness, this week on Hidden Brain from NPR.
Coming up at noon on 91.3 WLRN.
I love this station because it's so truthful. It's so deep.
I love WLRN. I love storytelling, and those segments for me are just like having a beautiful meal through my ears.
Members are WLRN's lifeblood. Public Media Giving Days May 1st and 2nd at WLRN.org.
You can visit History Miami Museum to celebrate 100 years of Girl Scouting in Miami and the Keys. The exhibition shares the Girl Scouts of tropical Florida's history of sisterhood and service. More at girlscoutsfl.org/100 years.
From NPR News in Washington, D.C., this is Weekend Edition. I'm Aisha Roscoe. Good morning. A new bill in Congress will crack down on food production companies who violate child labor laws. A lawmaker tells us more. And we hear from a migrant advocate who worked on farms as an undocumented teen.
The impacts that they experience from working in these fields tend to be lifelong, whether it's health impacts or mental health impacts or just the life cycle that they end up in.
Also, Princeton celebrates Toni Morrison on the 30th anniversary of her Nobel Prize in Literature. It's Sunday, April 30th. News is next.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Giles Snyder. The sheriff of San Jacinto County, Texas, says authorities have found a cell phone they believe belongs to the suspect in Friday night's killing of 5 people inside a home in the small town of Cleveland. But the suspect himself remains at large, and Sheriff Capers says the search area has been widened.
He could be anywhere now. We located the device that we were looking for, found it abandoned. There was some articles of clothing laying around. The tracking dogs from Texas Department of Corrections picked up the scent, and then they lost that scent in the water.
Authorities are looking for 38-year-old Francisco Rapeza. They say he was intoxicated when he carried out the shootings with an AR-15 style rifle after his neighbors asked him to stop firing off rounds in his yard because they were trying to sleep. Over the past several years, Republican state lawmakers in Texas have passed laws blocking local governments from regulating everything from fracking to ride-sharing services. Houston Public Media's Andrew Schneider says legislators are now poised to adopt a far broader measure that would dramatically limit home rule powers for cities and counties.
House Bill 2127 would block Texas cities and counties from passing regulations in areas including labor, the environment, and finance, among others. Hani Khalil heads the Texas Gulf Coast Area Labor Federation.
Local government's ability to protect tenants from slumlords could be banned. The ability to respond quickly to hurricanes and industrial fires could be banned. Many of the things that we have fought for, like a $15 minimum wage for airport workers and for workers on county construction projects.
The bill has already passed the Texas House. Republican State Senator Brandon Creighton says it could pass the Senate as early as next week. I'm Andrew Schneider in Houston.
Near record heat wave tore through California this weekend, sending torrents of melted snow gushing down rivers and streams. But California has largely avoided the damaging flooding that had been feared. Joshua Yeager is with member station KVPR. He reports that Yosemite National Park is reopening today after park officials closed much of the park as a precaution.
Yosemite National Park had closed late Friday in anticipation of possible flooding. While rivers are surging through the popular tourist destination, creating epic waterfalls and vistas, they didn't rise as high as forecasted. That's great news for tourists, but the region isn't out of the woods yet. A massive snowpack 3 times deeper than average still looms above the Central Valley. Snowmelt here is expected to peak in early July, and it's an open question whether water systems are up for the deluge. Californians can expect a reprieve from the heat this week. Temperatures are expected to plummet some 15 degrees, and forecasters say more snow is possible in May. For NPR News, I'm Joshua Yeager in Bakersfield.
And you're listening to NPR News. At the White House Correspondents' Dinner last night, President Biden cracked jokes at his own expense, but he turned serious when he called for the release of Americans being held abroad, including 2 journalists.
Journalism is not a crime. Evan and Austin should be released immediately, along with every other American held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad.
President Biden calling for the release of the Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich, who's been detained by Russia for the past month, and Austin Tice, who disappeared in Syria more than 10 years ago. The White House believes Tice is being held captive by the Syrian government. Film and television production in Hollywood has dropped markedly this year, and NPR's Neda Ulabi reports that's partly because of fears over a recession and a looming writer's strike.
Film production companies have been tightening their belts for a while, with, for example, substantial layoffs recently at Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, and Netflix. This is partly because of shareholders' insistence on profits, right when the economics of the streaming industry are still very much in flux. And filming is affected too. According to Film LA, a not-for-profit that handles shooting permits in Los Angeles, on-location filming in the area has fallen by 24% this year compared to the year before. Some entertainment industry insiders say that TV production companies in particular have been loath to start filming shows that could be shut down by the strike. Neda Ulabi, NPR News.
The writer's contract expires at midnight tomorrow. A strike by the Writers Guild of America would be the first in 15 years. I'm Giles Snyder, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Eric and Wendy Schmidt through the Schmidt Family Foundation.
working together to create a just world where all people have access to renewable energy, clean air and water, and healthy food. On the web at theschmidt.org.
South Motors presents Tropical Nights at Pinecrest Gardens, featuring multi-Grammy, Latin Grammy, and Billboard award-winning artist Pablo Chino Núñez on Friday, May 5th at 8 p.m. Chino and his big band orchestra will showcase the best of salsa music from the 90s to present times, featuring vocalists, dancers, and a special guest performance from multi-Grammy award winner Marlo Rosado. Tickets for this evening of great Latin jazz at pinecrestgardens.org/Tropical Nights.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Aisha Roscoe. Good morning. The Biden administration is making big changes to immigration policies in the country. Last Thursday, they announced measures that include ramping up deportations for migrants entering illegally and new processing centers in Guatemala and Colombia. But some lawmakers also want crackdowns in the U.S. labor market. They say many underage migrant children are being exploited by corporations, especially food production companies. One of those policymakers is Representative Greg Casar, a Democrat from Texas. On Tuesday, he introduced a bill called the Child Labor Exploitation Accountability Act. He joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So before we dive into the bill, I want to get your reaction to the Biden administration's new immigration announcements that they made.
I believe that we need more legal pathways for immigrants and immigrants coming to this country. The Biden administration, I believe, has had a mixed record on this. I don't think that by having more crackdowns against innocent families that are just coming here for a better life, that we're really going to turn out much better. But some of the Biden administration steps to have more legal pathways and orderly ways for folks to come here, I think that that's a step in the right direction. We need to see a change from top Republican officials if we want to see something happen. And so I believe that the Biden administration needs to move forward as much as they can on their own to provide legal and safe pathways for immigrating here. If we have legal pathways for immigrants to be able to work, not in the underground market, but work on a level playing field with everybody else, then it'll be easier for them to assert their rights when they're being exploited like we're seeing by these big meatpacking companies and other large corporations.
Well, let's dig into that. Briefly, your bill aims to prevent the Department of Agriculture from engaging in contracts with companies that have committed egregious labor law violations, especially employing minors and having them work in dangerous conditions. So how would your bill make sure that that actually happens?
Kids belong in the classroom, not on a factory floor. This bill would end U.S. Department of Agriculture contracts with these egregious violators. If they have continued and repeated violations, we could ultimately revoke their licenses. And so if these mega corporations know that their profits could take a hit, then guess what? We'll see less illegal child labor if the corporations know they'll actually be held accountable.
But I guess my question is, a lot of these violations will happen off the books. And, we've talked to experts and they say part of the issue is that the government doesn't necessarily know that these violations are happening. Do we have the resources to even know and police whether these violations are happening?
The Department of Labor needs more resources and staffing so that they can go and find out about these violations. But even when they do find out about the violations, the big corporations at the top of the food chain wipe their hands clean, and they say that it's their contractors or subcontractors that are exploiting child labor or have unsafe working conditions.
And so, I guess, so how exactly would that happen? The contractor would have to be found to have been in violation by some authority, and then they would alert the USDA so that they could take action on the contracts. Is that how that would work?
That's right. We have required in the bill that any labor violation that is found has to be reported to the federal government. And so one of the potential labor violations is intimidating or retaliating against workers that speak out. We need stronger whistleblower protections for those workers. Sometimes folks that exploit immigrant workers say we're going to call immigration on you if you speak up about unsafe working conditions. And the Biden administration just announced that we can now provide protections for those immigrant workers to say, no, you're not going to get deported if you speak up about what's happening on the job.
In Arkansas last month, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders signed a law that's going to make it easier for teens as young as 14 to work without getting a permit, and other Republicans are looking to loosen child labor laws. They're citing the tight labor market. Is your bill in response or also in response to these kind of changes?
In response to the massive increase in child labor, there's two ways to respond to that. You could either be on the side of the mega corporations or on the side of the kids. My bill is to protect the kids because these big companies are going to be all right if they have to pay a decent wage, if they have to respect union rights and not put kids in dangerous situations. They're going to still be able to sell their food products, but they shouldn't be able to make record profits while using child labor, while having unsafe working conditions.
That's Representative Greg Casar from Texas. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Aisha.
And now we turn to Maria Lopez Gonzalez. She is the Deputy Director of El Pueblo, a nonprofit based in North Carolina that advocates for migrant workers' rights. As a child, Maria worked on farms. She would put together bales of hay or pick blueberries alongside her parents. But it's the long days of working on a hog farm that stays with her.
The smell stays with you. I remember growing up in my dad's hands, always smelling that, like the smell of the feed. And the smell just lingers, and I hated it because the bus would pick us up from school and there was no hiding that part of us. And now I don't care. I don't mind it. I'm not ashamed of it. But at the time, I wanted nothing more than to be like everyone else and not have, not only be extremely different in the way that I looked, being, brown and Latina and immigrant, but to having everybody know what my parents did and what I did, and just the impact just seeped into every part of our life.
Did the people at the farms know that, you were a kid and you were working?
So, at the hog farm, they did. It was a very small farm, maybe less than 20 employees probably, and we would be paid under the table. And he was a decent person, the farmer. He really cared about the children that came to the farm, and I think to a degree he understood that the parents just had no other choice. And so when we were younger, maybe younger than 13 probably, none of us were paid. And then once we were around 13, 14, 15, we started asking to get paid, and that's kind of when we had to take it seriously and actually work and not just be there following our parents around.
So now you're doing this work, you're doing the advocacy work. When you're talking to farm workers, what are they asking for? And especially, are you also talking to some of those young people who are out there on these farms as well?
Yeah, so one group gave us a long list. And the things ranged from a washer and dryer that works in the farm, ability to send my kids to college, ability to unionize. And then at other times, their wishes were very simple. They were just like, we just want to be respected. We just want to be treated with dignity. We just want to have a world where we can work and be safe and feel comfortable. And with the youth, I have felt that with people that grew up very similar to me, you don't realize that it's a difficult situation you're living in. You don't realize, I want something different for my future in the same context that maybe their parents do. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of your part of life.
We just spoke to Representative Greg Casar. He's introduced the Child Labor Exploitation Accountability Act that aims to hold corporations accountable for exploiting children working in the food industry. Do you think these kind of laws, if they're passed, would be enough to deal with some of these issues?
We need them, but I don't think it's enough because there's always going to be a way around it. And agriculture just has so many exceptions in other areas of their labor laws that it's so easily manipulated. There are children right now in a lot of the meat processing plants in North Carolina who just work with false papers. The employers know they work with false papers, and they're able to get around E-Verify, or they're not even required to use E-Verify the way that other workplaces are. And they'll do kind of these routine checks where people will find out, hey, there's going to be some sort of inspection. Don't come to work tomorrow, to make sure that children aren't being caught working there. And so there's always a way around it.
But do you have any thoughts on what needs to happen to stop the exploitation of young migrant workers?
Yes, I think that we need to, one, increase pay. We need to have stronger standard protections for workers in the fields, for heat standards. There needs to be access to water, there needs to be access to bathrooms, there needs to be access to shade, there needs to be training on what to do to respond. If their coworkers have fallen ill, we need to have better insurance policies. We need to have access to transportation in these rural areas. We need to have employers providing interpreters or working with clinics that can have interpretation for the workers. We need to have just better protections all across the board so that people want to work here, so that people feel safe, and so that people are being paid enough. And that will make it where we don't need to put children in these fields.
That's Maria Lopez Gonzalez. She is a former teen farm worker and immigrant rights advocate with the nonprofit El Pueblo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to NPR News.
Peter Sagal here from Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. You know that car you've been hanging on to because it makes you look young and full of life? Well, to be honest, you haven't aged a bit, but the car, on the other hand, it's looking a little, soft around the timing belt. Here's the thought, why not donate it to public radio? You will still look fabulous, maybe more so as you bask in the glow of doing the right thing for your favorite NPR station.
Learn more at WLRN.org or call 877-WLRN-CAR.
The Coral Gables Community Foundation, celebrating its 32nd year in the City Beautiful, has been called the cornerstone of philanthropy in Coral Gables, connecting beneficiaries and benefactors to help address their community's needs. More at gablesfoundation.org.
When it's weekend news, information, and entertainment you're looking for, you know where to turn. Weekend Edition Sunday on 91.3 WLRN, 91.5 in the Keys, and 101.9 in the Palm Beaches. The time is 9:19. NPR News headlines next.
I'm Giles Snyder with these headlines. Authorities in Texas are still searching for a man wanted in Friday night's mass shooting inside a home in the small town of Cleveland. 5 people were killed. The manhunt now includes the FBI. 6 high school students are reported injured in southern Mississippi after gunfire broke out at a house party. It happened overnight in Bay St. Louis. Police say they have arrested a 19-year-old suspect whom they call the sole shooter. And the National Weather Service in Florida has confirmed that storm damage in Palm Beach Gardens this weekend was caused by a tornado. Vehicles were flipped over and trees were uprooted. The state remains under a tornado watch, and forecasters say the threat is moving north into the Carolinas today. I'm Giles Snyder, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Rice University, where challenging convention, exploring new ideas, and making a positive impact is central to how they define unconventional wisdom. More at unconventional.rice.edu. And from the Walton Family Foundation, working to solve social and environmental problems to improve lives today and benefit future generations. More information at waltonfamilyfoundation.org. This is NPR.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Aisha Roscoe. Last night in Washington, D.C., one of the rites of spring, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where journalists get dressed up and presidents become stand-ups.
After all, I believe in the First Amendment. Not just because my good friend Jimmy Madison wrote it.
President Biden made fun of his age several times last night, having just announced that at 80, he's running for re-election. NPR's Scott Detrow was there. I know because I saw him. I was there too, and he joins us now. How tired are you?
Listen, Aisha, I don't get out that much anymore, so I had to maximize. I am very tired this morning.
It's same. So how did Biden do with his, kind of stand-up routine that they always do?
He started on a serious note, we should say, talking about press freedom, demanding the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who's being detained unfairly in Russia. Then Biden turned on the funny. A lot of jokes about his age, also some digs on cable news. Here's a mix of both.
You say I'm ancient. I say I'm wise. You say I'm over the hill. Don Lemon would say that's a man in his prime.
A lot of jokes about Fox News as well, especially that sudden departure of Tucker Carlson and the network's settlement with Dominion Voting Systems over Fox's false claims about the 2020 election. I think Biden was funnier than last year. He brought the jokes.
Well, pundits, I want to turn to the serious side of this, pundits have highlighted polls showing that a majority of Democrats have said they do not want Biden to run, but that's kind of moot now because he's running. So the real question seems to be, do they plan to vote for him? Is the president worried about that?
It's interesting, really not especially. Obviously, Biden is going to campaign, but his team has a pretty confident view that Democratic voters who wish he would do more are going to end up voting for him next year, especially if the alternative is Donald Trump coming back to the White House. And equally, Biden and his advisors are confident that Trumpism has alienated enough independent voters that they'll largely back Biden as well, even though polls, including NPR's most recent poll this week, shows Biden is pretty unpopular with independents right now. This view, like a lot of things, has a lot of Democrats anxious, but Biden's advisors point to the midterms and Democrats over at last year's midterms as a sign that this approach could work.
The other hot topic in Washington these days is flexing over the debt ceiling. House Republicans passed a bill. It's unlikely to get through the Senate. Biden has said he would veto it if it did. So any clues on how long this standoff will go? Will it go as it usually does, right until the very last minute?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing with brinkmanship, right? You have to get it to the brink. So I think this will almost certainly stay in this stalemate until the idea of the U.S. defaulting on its debt gets much more real and much more immediate. That exact date is still uncertain, but it's probably within the next few months. The White House says, look, the U.S. needs to pay its bills. These are things the U.S. already took money out, already decided to spend money on. They need to pay the bills. House Republicans are trying to use this leverage at this moment to force some spending cuts and also try to force Biden to undo some of his big policy achievements of the last couple of years. And Biden has said absolutely no.
That's NPR's Scott Detrow. Thank you, Scott, and get some sleep.
I hope naps are in the future for both of us today. Nice to talk to you.
In some cities, homelessness has become a much more visible problem. That's left some parents and teachers trying to figure out how to talk to children about the people they see living on the streets, as Katie of Riddle reports from Portland, Oregon.
For third graders at the Cathedral School, witnessing homelessness is part of daily life.
I want you to think about your own journeys into school today.
Teacher Ingrid Trachtenberg is talking to her students on a recent morning.
Did you witness anyone sleeping outside?
Every child raises their hand. This private Catholic school is downtown. Unsheltered people wander by the playground regularly. Sometimes they're distressed and in crisis. Trachtenberg encourages candor in these conversations. Here's her student Florence Bauer.
On my way home, I go under the bridge, and under the bridge, there's this ginormous homeless camp, and there's a bunch of tents and things. When you walk up to those people, they you don't know them, and sometimes they can be scarier than other people.
So we're called as Catholics to look at those who are poor as the same as each and every one of us. And like Flo said, that's kind of scary, right?
Trachtenberg says when her students feel safe and heard, they can develop empathy, even for people who might scare them.
So let's pivot to what can we do? What are we called to do as Catholics and really as good people?
You should help them.
That was student Simon Burke.
Because you don't need more stuff. They actually need stuff because they don't even have a roof over the head.
Trachtenberg also tries to show her students how to take initiative on this issue.
And then we'll make our way to the table to start making our sack lunches.
After their discussion, the class prepares food for homeless people. The Blanchet house is a few miles away. The class will donate their sandwiches here to help feed people like Vanessa Snick.
Being homeless is hard enough because it takes you out of the real world.
Snick is eating lunch at the Blanchet house on a recent day, holding her small dog on her lap. She's been homeless for 9 years. She suggests the most important thing to remember when talking about and to homeless people, they're human.
Sometimes I don't feel like I'm part of society. People have to understand that we're not here by choice, you know. And it's hard to get off the street.
And we've got pants on one side and some shirts and then a few socks and gloves.
A volunteer helps people find clothing in another part of Blanchet House. Zale Lear picks some pants off the rack.
Rain pants, I needed those.
Lear has been on the street for close to a decade. Fundamentally, he wants the same things everyone else does.
I think people are actually just looking for like regularity, like not being treated differently.
Eye contact, a nod, a smile. 18-year-old Brooke Plass is a volunteer at Blanchet House. She remembers her first shift here.
I just came home and I felt like I was just so happy to have gone. It made me really, it filled me with joy, honestly.
She wasn't always as comfortable around homeless people as she is now. She remembers a different experience from when she was much younger.
I think I said to my mom, I was like, why is that man sitting there? Like, where's his house? Then I was really confused.
Brooke's mom, Rachel Plass, recalls a conversation with her young daughter about a homeless person asking them to give money.
I remember her debating and wondering why I wasn't.
She didn't have an immediate answer.
You know, they're looking for something. It says they have a sign. It looks like they have a legitimate need. Why not give the money that way?
I say to parents more often than you can imagine in my sessions, do you love your child enough to allow him to be unhappy?
Therapist Betsy Brown Braun wrote a parenting book called Just Tell Me What to Say. Parents and teachers often want to shield their children from witnessing tragedy and hardship, but in cities like Portland, with the issue of homelessness, that's impossible. Braun says it's better to be direct.
Because your child learns that Mommy's going to answer my question. She's going to be honest. There's no question that's too bad to ask.
A question like, how could someone become homeless? That's one Rachel Plass had to field.
You know, I would try to explain that circumstances led them there.
Plass says there are no clear answers. Still, she wouldn't have her kids unsee this problem.
Because they shouldn't, you know, live in a space where they just think everything is wonderful and these problems aren't out there.
Her daughter, Brooke Plass, is now a senior in high school. The family started volunteering together to help homeless people. Now, Brooke does it by herself.
And I feel inspired, you know, that to make more of a difference because now I'm aware. I think without awareness, there's no change.
She's become friendly with a number of the unhoused people she sees regularly.
They have so much to tell me and have had such rich lives, and like we should listen. I don't think we listen enough.
Of course, listening is not going to solve the deep structural problems around homelessness, but it's a start for these kids who will someday be the adults responsible for solutions. For NPR News, I'm Katie Riddle in Portland, Oregon.
The Bluest Eye, Beloved, Song of Solomon. Toni Morrison is one of the most banned authors in the U.S. right now. She's also the only Black woman to have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Before Morrison died in 2019, she taught at Princeton University. To commemorate the 30th anniversary of her Nobel win, Princeton has opened the doors to her archives with a new exhibit. NPR's Netta Ulaby paid a visit.
When Toni Morrison came here to teach literature in the 1980s, she was one of the first 2 African-American women ever hired as Princeton faculty. Now there's a building on campus named after her. That's where Autumn Womack works. She's a professor who curated this exhibition from Toni Morrison's archives.
This is the first time that most of this material has been displayed.
I have to be able to make mistakes.
and not know that they're mistakes.
The material from Morrison's archives includes diary entries, unreleased recordings, and drafts of novels, such as Sula and Beloved. But what you see when you walk into the exhibition are pages and pages that are waterlogged, smeared, and partly burnt.
Yeah. So these are the fire-singed pieces from the house fire.
Womack says Morrison's house accidentally burned down in 1993, the same year she won the Nobel Prize. A team of archivists saved Morrison's work. They wrapped every surviving page in mylar. Scholars are grateful for the letters and lists and materials dating back to when the author was a girl in Ohio named Chloe Ardelia Wofford.
There's material where you see her playing around with her name. There's Chloe Wofford, Toni Wofford, and then we get Toni Morrison.
Toni Morrison scholars came to Princeton recently to discuss her life and work. Some noted what it means for Princeton to have this archive rather than Howard, the historically black university where Morrison went to college. The archive is filled with treasures. Princeton professor Kanohi Nishikawa co-organized this conference. He points to documentation of an argument between Morrison and renowned opera director Peter Sellers. She defended the Shakespeare play Othello. He found it irrelevant. So she wrote an opera called Desdemona. Sellers wound up directing.
I exist in between now, between being killed and being undead.
It was called Desdemona. By the time you come out, you don't even think of it as an adaptation of Othello. It's its own thing with its own sound and its own lyrical voice.
A revelation of this new exhibition is Toni Morrison's connection to theater. She starred in plays at Howard and wrote screenplay adaptations of some of her own novels. To honor her Nobel anniversary, Princeton commissioned performers to create works based on Toni Morrison's archives.
Dear Miss Morrison, the kitchen doors shut. They send us away. Shoo, shoo, shoo.
That's Daniel Alexander Jones, a Guggenheim-winning theater artist.
Whoa, it blew my mind.
Diving into the archives of one of the best writers in U.S. history was enthralling but intimidating, Jones says. Imagine having Toni Morrison's voice in your ear as you write musical theater to honor her.
You know you can do better. you know you can dig deeper. You know that's not the right word. You know you can think in a more complicated way about that idea.
Jones is not surprised that some of Toni Morrison's most celebrated novels are now banned from libraries and schools in Florida, Virginia, Utah, Texas, and Missouri. These books, he says, speak to division, incivility, and rage.
She gave us codes and keys to deal with everything we are facing right now. And if you go back, you will receive them. There are answers there.
Did you find an answer?
Many. I found many answers. And chief among them, this question of how we take the venom of this time and transmute it.
Transmute it into medicine.
Language can never live up to life once and for all, nor should it.
In her Nobel Prize speech from 1993, Toni Morrison said language cannot express human pain, racism, or war. Its force, she said, is in its reach.
Be it grand or slender, borrowing, blasting, or refusing to sanctify.
They are words for our time. They always were.
Unmolested language surges toward knowledge, not its destruction.
Neda Ulabi, NPR News.
You're listening to Weekend Edition from NPR News. Many of Florida's most historic buildings are along its coastal areas. But what do you do if they're not up to code or deemed unsafe? The state Senate just passed a bill that would prevent local governments from blocking any demolition of those buildings. Supporters say it'll protect people from structures that are old and prone to flooding. But critics worry developers will swoop in and destroy iconic towns. Veronica Zaragovia of member station WLRN in Miami reports.
Welcome to our Art Deco tour, sponsored by the Miami Design Preservation League.
Each time Melinda Berman gives a tour of Miami Beach's brightly colored Art Deco buildings, she asks people to share where they're from.
Singapore,
Denmark, France.
Connecticut.
She points out features that make these buildings from the 1930s and 40s so recognizable.
The element of threes, the two symmetrical sides, and the center rising taller in the middle. See those little shelves over the windows? We call those eyebrows to shade the rooms from the sun.
Berman volunteers with the Miami Design Preservation League. Activists want to keep these Art Deco structures intact, as does Miami Beach Commissioner Alex Fernandez.
These are the buildings that housed World War II servicemen,
including Clark Gable, who had already filmed Gone with the Wind when he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1942.
It's American history that will be bulldozed with Senator Brian Avila's bill.
Republican Brian Avila sponsored the measure that Florida's Senate passed Friday. He says it'll target dangerous buildings.
We're certainly very appreciative of our history and historical structures, but not all these structures have a historical significance.
His bill would allow owners to tear down buildings in high-risk coastal flood zones mapped by the Federal Emergency Management Agency if they don't conform to FEMA standards for new construction, or if local building officials say they're unsafe, or if local governments want them to come down.
If a building is in one of these situations, it should be able to be rebuilt.
There's an exception for buildings on the National Register of Historic Places and for those older than 200 years. When demolition is allowed, new buildings don't have to resemble the old ones. They can be as tall or as big as the local rules allow.
I don't want to be the guy that goes down in history as putting up a skyscraper in Miami's Art Deco district or in St. Augustine Beach.
That's Republican State Representative Spencer Roach defending a version of the bill that he's trying to get Florida's House to approve.
It makes housing more affordable, increases property values, increase revenue to local governments, and it helps alleviate blight.
Critics worry about the potential influence of developers. A company called 13th Floor Investments gave $10,000 each to political action committees led by Roach and Avila around the same time the House and Senate bills were filed. 13th Floor, which has oceanfront parcels in Miami Beach, has said the donations weren't related to the legislation. Fernandez, the Miami Beach commissioner, says the measure would hurt tourism and erode the city's charm.
That attraction is being stripped away from Miami Beach. And once you strip that away, we end up being just any other coastal community.
The House is set to vote on the bill next week. If it passes, it goes to Governor Ron DeSantis, who hasn't said whether he'll sign it. For NPR News, I'm Veronica Zaragovia in Miami Beach.
This is NPR News.
Whether you're listening on your radio, your smartphone, or your computer, we're glad you're along for this edition of Weekend Edition Sunday. We're South Florida's only NPR news source, 91.3 WLRN. There's much more coming up in just a moment. Please stay with us.
You're invited to come together and celebrate peace, love, and the Beatles with Rain, a tribute to the Beatles coming to the Parker May 6th. You can experience songs from Abbey Road and the rooftop concert live. Rain, a tribute to the Beatles. Get back to where you once belonged. May 6th at the Parker. Tickets at parkerplayhouse.com. We're funded by WLRN members and by Dakota Lithium, providing deep cycle lithium batteries for boats, RVs, golf carts, and fishing electronics. You can experience twice the power and half the weight of traditional batteries. More information is at dakotalithium.com.
I'm Giles Snyder with these headlines. The rival military factions in Sudan are accusing each other of violating a ceasefire that's set to expire later today. The two sides are locked in a battle for control of the capital, Khartoum. The State Department, meanwhile, says it's helping the hundreds of American civilians who were evacuated to travel on to the Saudi Arabian port city of Jeddah. The Americans arrived at Port Sudan on the Red Sea this weekend in a bus convoy organized by the U.S. government. And Paraguay's ruling party is facing an electoral challenge today. Voters are going to the polls in a presidential election, and the Colorado Party's candidate is locked in a close race. The party has dominated Paraguayan politics for decades, but corruption allegations and a slowing economy has taken a toll on its popularity. I'm Giles Snyder, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Bank of America, offering access to resources and digital tools designed to help local to global companies make moves for their businesses. Learn more at bankofamerica.com/banking for business. And from Indeed, a hiring platform committed to helping businesses of all sizes. Businesses can invite candidates to apply, then schedule and conduct interviews in one place. Indeed.com/NPR.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Aisha Roscoe. Is it okay to enjoy art if its creator is compromised? Maybe you love Michael Jackson's music. Or you want to watch Woody Allen's Annie Hall.
A relationship, I think, is like a shark. You know, it has to constantly move forward or it dies. And I think what we got on our hands is a dead shark.
Or laugh at Bill Cosby.
And I looked, and there was chocolate cake. The child wanted chocolate cake for breakfast.
What do we do with the art of monstrous men? Asked writer Claire Dederer in an essay back in 2017 amid the Harvey Weinstein revelations and Me Too movement. It's a question that continues to trouble her as she tracks more examples, like Kanye West. And it's not all men. Think some Harry Potter fans' distress over J.K. Rowling's comments about gender. It's all part of Claire Dederer's new book called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a thrill to talk with you.
Well, so, you know, there are examples of so many people in this book, and you do caution against equivalencies. So how did you come to define monster for this book?
Yeah, I think that was a really challenging part early in the process. I started sort of thinking about this problem in maybe 2014 or 2015, and then came the kind of big reckoning we had at the end of 2017. And in the context of that moment, this idea of the monster sort of emerged, you know, this way that we would sort of look at these men who were being accused and think of them as monstrous. And at first I sort of went unthinkingly with that language and sort of the way that it just held all this anger and all this blame. So I started to question whether it was really the right word to describe what was happening, because what I really saw was just the work being disrupted by the acts of these people who'd done this rotten thing.
And the way that you talked about it, and I think that this is kind of an apt metaphor, is that you kind of said it's like a stain.
Right, and I think the reason the stain was such a useful image for me to think about was that I liked the idea that indelibility, like that stain, that just like indelible mark, is not a choice. Like when you drop the wine on the carpet, you're not making a decision for it to spill across the floor. Experience when I learned something about an artist whose work I love. You know, I don't want to know it, but I do know it, and now I have to figure out what to do.
You got your start as a film critic,
Mm-hmm.
and so in a lot of this book, you talk about how you've struggled with some of the directors.
Yeah, I think that Roman Polanski was really where this all started for me. I had been researching his rape of a 13-year-old girl in a previous book I was writing. I read the girl's deposition. I really learned all about the crime, and I was still able to consume the work. And so he's sort of the ultimate kind of embodiment of the problem, because the work is so good to me and so important to me, and the crime is truly awful. It's something that I have a strong sense of identification with the victim, right? So there's a way in which there you are, you're stuck between two immovable objects. So yes, Polanski was the jumping off point, but I also think there's a way in which music is really crucial to this question. You know, you go see a film or you sit down and read a book, but music is there and it lives with you.
And you play it over and over.
But also it comes to stand in for these like eras in your life. You know, you remember when you were a teenager or when you were falling in love with your partner or whatever, there's often music that's really tied to that. So the musical examples tend to be the really heartbreaking examples for a lot of people.
You invoke your kids at points in this book, their friends. There is a generational thing to it, because it does seem like there is been a shift in fandom and in the way we process, you know, fandom and being obsessed with something. You talk about this in the book. I'm going to have you read a little bit of it.
Sure. I'll read a little bit about this idea of obsession that you brought up. Obsession. When we say we're obsessed with something, it means I am a fan, a super fan, an intergalactic fan. I am verily defined by this thing. It is my personality. It is me. I am it.
And so to me, I do feel like that is just so key, because it feels like when people say they are a fan of someone these days, they're not just saying, oh, I like their music, oh, I like their art. They're saying this person is a reflection of me and my values. And if this person is bad, then that means I'm bad. Right? Like, am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I think you are reading that perfectly. I think that that's one of the reasons that it's important to think about this stuff right now. You know, there's this sort of question of why write this book now? Why address this now? How is this moment different from moments in the past? And, you know, I'm 56 years old. And when I was young, I was certainly a fan of things. I was a fan of lots of things. I just didn't know anything about the makers of those things. You know, I would have the 4 photos of the Beatles on my bedroom wall, and I'd be, you know, well, obviously George is the cutest, and that was sort of the extent of what I knew. And now that is a 180-degree turnaround. We now know everything about everyone. So there's this kind of simultaneous self-expression as fan and too much knowledge as fan. And, or maybe just the right amount of knowledge for some people, but it comes together to create this very intense identification between the person who loves the work and the artists themselves.
But is this a solvable dilemma? Because when you talk about how deep that identification can be, you know, people may no longer listen to R. Kelly music. And then do you watch a Harvey Weinstein movie? Like, where are the lines?
Right. I think in every single case, there is a set of circumstances that we can look at and that are specific to that artist. But one of the big projects of the book is to get out of this idea that there's an authority there telling us what we ought to do. In both cases, you know, I feel like there's often a response that you just have to separate the art from the artist. And what I very quickly realized as I started thinking about that is like, that's impossible for me in the case of, for instance, Manhattan by Woody Allen. You know, that's this film about a 40-something man having a relationship with a teenage girl, high school girl. But I don't get to tell you what your line is. This whole conversation is predicated on a moment and a movement where people say when they were hurt by somebody, when somebody stands up and says, this happens to me. And the way that we deal, what happens after that person says that is not perfect. But that moment of the person saying that this is wrong is crucial. Because if we don't listen to people when they say something's wrong, how can we do better?
And then you have the information to make an informed decision about what you consume.
Exactly. And I don't think that that decision is necessarily a decision that's based on forgiveness. And I don't think it's based on forgetting. I think that you can know what you know and live with that complexity and be a complicated person yourself with your own history. And at the same time, maybe still engage with the work.
That's Claire Dieterer. Her new book is Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Internet, cyberspace, sex free.
The World Wide Web is 30 today. That's what many of us just refer to as being online. And later today,
take a spin, now you're in with the techno set. You're going surfing on the internet.
On All Things Considered, hear more about the birth of the web in the public domain. Listen online at this station's website at npr.org or on your radio. We are taking a few minutes now to remember the life and the work of Rabbi Harold Kushner.
There's always a fresh supply of grieving people asking, where was God when I needed him most?
That's Harold Kushner speaking to NPR in 2010. He died last week at the age of 88. Kushner wrote a number of books, bestsellers that comforted millions of people, including one with a title you might remember, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He wrote it after the death of his teenage son.
If I, walking through the wards of a hospital, have to face the fact that either God is all-powerful but not kind, or thoroughly kind and loving but not totally powerful, I would rather compromise God's power and affirm his love. So the conclusion, the theological conclusion I came to, is that God could have been all-powerful at the beginning, but he chose to designate two areas of life off limits to his power. He would not arbitrarily interfere with laws of nature. And secondly, God would not take away our freedom to choose between good and evil.
Joining us now to talk about Harold Kushner's legacy is his daughter, Ariel Kushner Haber. Thank you so much for joining us, and I am so sorry for your loss.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Listening to your father just now, how do you think that conclusion he made about God, how do you think that influenced how he led his life?
Those philosophies, though, that theology was something he was grappling with as a very young rabbi all along. And throughout my brother's illness, and when you follow the arc of his career, you see him really continue to develop those ideas. And it meant so much to him that he was able to comfort others with his words. I don't know that that was something he always anticipated would happen, but maybe it was something he hoped he would be able to achieve.
Do you think that he was surprised by the reaction to his books? And how did that change his life and by extension, your family's life, that he brought comfort to so many people?
I think he was surprised by it, and also he never stopped being gratified when people would come up to them and share their stories, and he received a lot of fan mail. And when he first finished the manuscript of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, initially he didn't have an easy time finding a publisher for it, but then he did settle on Schocken Books, and it was a little bit smaller publishing house and a Jewish publishing house. We were on a family vacation when we got news that a bidding war had started between the Literary Guild and the Book of the Month Club. Finally, by the way, Book of the Month Club won out that bidding war. And we, jumped in the car to go celebrate at a restaurant, and it started pouring rain, and we were so excited. We just abandoned our car and went in the rain to the restaurant and celebrated. We were really, really excited.
Your father spoke to NPR many times. He's very gentle, very thoughtful. And one time he joined us to talk about a different kind of spiritual confusion. This is a little more lighthearted. The confusion of being a diehard fan, used to seeing his team lose, suddenly faced with that team winning big. I'm talking about his love of the Boston Red Sox. Let's take a listen to the conversation he had with us when they won the World Series in 2004.
What will we have to yearn for? What will we have to complain about? What are all those people who call talk radio going to be able to call and vent about? It's going to be a major readjustment for a whole lot of people in the Boston area and all of Red Sox Nation around the country.
Did he ever come to terms with a winning Red Sox team?
Well, it's so funny. I think probably his book, When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough, maybe it speaks to that a little bit. He really did love being a Red Sox fan, and one of his big splurges after the success of When Bad Things Happen to Good People was he bought season tickets to the Red Sox. And I think he really got to share some of his love of baseball with his grandchildren. So he did get to continue to enjoy being a Red Sox fan.
What do you think your father's legacy will be?
Well, it's really my hope that his words and his theology will continue to resonate with people. And at the time when Bad Things Happen to Good People came out, I think some of his theology was quite controversial. And it's interesting to see over time how much a lot of that theology has become adopted. So I hope that people will continue to be able to find comfort, not just from When Bad Things Happen to Good People, but from some of his other writings. I particularly think the book that he wrote, The Lord is My Shepherd, on the 23rd Psalm, is wonderful and will resonate with people. And I think it's important to note, too, that how much his book was embraced, or his philosophies, theology was embraced and received by the interfaith community. And I think that was something that really surprised him, and that he was incredibly gratified and thrilled for, to sort of be able to bridge those divisions.
There's a traditional Jewish response to losing someone, that is, may their memory be a blessing. If you don't mind sharing, what memory do you think will comfort you the most?
The way that he interacted with his grandchildren, just the way he involved themselves in their learning and their everyday lives, and the joy that they brought to him was really wonderful. And of course, those are, some of the greatest memories for me personally.
That's Ariel Kushner-Haber talking about her father, the late Rabbi Harold Kushner, author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Aisha, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Aisha Roscoe.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Cunard, offering travelers an opportunity to voyage aboard Cunard's Queen Elizabeth to Alaska. Guests can explore ports and scenic cruising through Glacier Bay National Park with locally sourced cuisine. More at cunard.com. And from Staples, with supplies to get business done, no matter where it gets done. From ink and toner cartridges to technology like laptops and networking accessories. More at Staples stores or staples.com.
This is 91.3 WLRN and HD1 Miami Fort Lauderdale, 91.5 WKWM and HD1 Marathon Key West, 105.5 WOLL HD2 Hope Sound, and 101.9 NPR for the Palm Beaches.
Hi, I'm Michael Stock. Every Sunday on Folk and Acoustic Music, I bring you the best in contemporary and traditional, bluegrass, blues, old-time music, and folk music. Plus interviews this Sunday with Evan Frankel. And we remember Pete Seeger. His birthday is coming up. Jeff Beal will be in the studio. The Public Storyteller with Dr. Karen Neal is at 4 o'clock. Folk and Acoustic Music, Sunday afternoon, starting at 2.
If you are focused on growing your business, the SBDC at Florida International University provides no-cost business consulting from Miami to the Florida Keys. Since January 2020, the SBDC has helped local businesses access over $275 million in capital and launch over 220 businesses. Their award-winning experts can help you grow. Learn more at sbdc.fiu.edu or 305-779-9230.
WLRN listeners patronize the arts and culture in our community. You'll find them visiting museums, art galleries, and the symphony. Help your business or organization reach them by becoming a WLRN sponsor. For more information, visit WLRN.org/underwriting.
WBEZ Chicago, it's This American Life. I'm Ira Glass.
In the monobargain in the year of 1912, the kidnapping of Dunbar, that was a mystery, bad to tell.
It used to be if something was big news, it got turned into a song. This one's about a famous kidnapping that happened in 1912, the kidnapping of Bobby Dunbar, a 4-year-old boy. For 2 years, the details of his disappearance and the search for him and how he was found and the trial of his kidnapper was all front-page news, reported breathlessly all across the country. But some of the biggest mysteries of the case were never solved, until, long after nearly everybody involved was dead, almost a century after it happened, the mysteries finally got solved. And one of Bobby Dunbar's descendants started poking around the old stories, looking for answers she wasn't really expecting to find. Today we devote our entire show to the legend of Bobby Dunbar and to what his granddaughter discovered. The messy, real story of what actually happened, which, as you'll hear, turns out to be a lot more interesting than the legend. Today's show is a rerun, by the way. Tal McThenia is our reporter.
Everybody in the family knew it. The legend of Bobby Dunbar, the lost boy who was found.
Well, the legend was that back in the early 1900s, my grandfather became missing.
My grandfather had gone on a camping trip with his parents. It was on a lake.
Swayze Lake. It's actually a swamp in Louisiana. And he disappeared.
Bobby was just 4 years old at the time, and Swayze Lake was teeming with alligators, surrounded by dark, thick woods. There was a massive search that started in the swamp and spread across the country, but nothing for 8 months, until...
They found him in Mississippi in the hands of a Mr. Walters.
The peddler in Columbia, Mississippi.
They brought him home, rode in on a fire truck.
There was a tremendous parade with a fire truck, and the whole town came out, and there was a band, and everybody celebrated, and he was found.
But Bobby Dunbar wasn't out of danger yet. Someone else tried to claim him, another mother. She'd lost her child too, and said that the boy they found in Mississippi was hers. There was a big trial that proved her wrong, and Bobby stayed with his parents, Percy and Leslie Dunbar, in Opelousas, where he lived for the rest of his life.
It was just a story, a tale you would tell, your grandchildren.
Which she would know. She was one of them. Margaret Dunbar Cutright, out of everyone in the family, was the most captivated by the legend of her grandfather's kidnapping. As a girl, she would beg her grandmother to tell the story over and over. When she had children of her own, Margaret told them the legend too. Then in 1999, her younger brother Robbie died in a plane crash. A month later, she was sitting in the den with her father, and he gave her a scrapbook that had been her great-grandmother's, overstuffed with photographs and letters and newspaper clippings from the early 1900s, all about her grandfather's kidnapping.
It was about 400 articles, not in chronological order. Dad said this would be a great project for you, Margaret. He had no idea what would come of that.
Without realizing it, Bob had set his daughter on a path that would nearly tear their family apart. But in the beginning, all Margaret knew was that the scrapbook felt like the thing she'd been waiting for. In 1999, her kids were growing up and in the house less and less. Her husband Wayne was working in a different state and only home on weekends. And Margaret was in mourning for her brother. She had long, empty days, and the scrapbook could fill them. But the more she dug in, the more she began to realize this was not the breezy adventure tale she'd grown up imagining. Even the simplest moments in the story, like when her great-grandparents are finally united with their son after an 8-month-long national search. Reporters from several papers were following the couple, Leslie and Percy Dunbar, on the train to Mississippi. Throngs of people were surrounding the house where the boy was being kept. Leslie and Percy went inside, but reports diverge on what happened next.
This article, it says that the mother faints. The headline reads, "Mother faints, sight of kidnapped child." When the mother reached the house where the boy was being kept, he was asleep. Mrs. Dunbar made a careful examination of the lad without awakening him, and was standing over the bed a few hours later when the child opened his eyes. The boy recognized his mother instantly. "Mother," he cried, as he reached up and stretched out his arms to her. The mother convulsively embraced the boy and then fainted. In the second article, the headline was, "Mrs. Dunbar not positive lad is her missing boy." When they reached the home, the child was asleep at the time. When awakened, it began to cry. Mrs. Dunbar looked in the dim light of a smoky oil lamp and then fell back with a gasp. "I do not know. I am not quite sure," faltered Mrs. Dunbar.
In fact, Percy and Leslie both told the papers that the boy didn't look like their son. His eyes were too small. But then the next day, they came back and Leslie gave the boy a bath and identified the moles and scars on his skin and declared he was hers. And according to some newspapers, Bobby didn't recognize his father or mother either, or his brother Alonzo. One paper said, quote, "Bobby at first meeting turns upon Alonzo with a scowl of anger. There appeared no recognition of his little brother." And then another paper said, quote, "The instant they met, Robert said, 'There's my Bubba Alonzo,' and reached over and kissed him."
It was a frequent occurrence in the newspapers to contradict one another. It's very difficult to know for certain what really happened.
So to sort out what happened, to try to get to the truth of the story, Margaret went on an obsessive quest to small-town libraries and archives and courthouses all over the South. For her birthday, her husband gave her a card for the Library of Congress, and she spent weeks in the reading rooms there. And as she dug into the historical record, certain figures from the family legend started to seem like real people for the first time. Take the mother who came forward and claimed that Bobby Dunbar was actually her child. Margaret had never given her much thought. She'd just been the woman trying to steal her grandfather. But in the newspapers, this woman has a name, Julia Anderson. She's a single mom working in North Carolina as a field hand and a caretaker for the parents of William C. Walters, the kidnapper. Walters claimed that Julia gave him the boy willingly, that his name wasn't Bobby Dunbar, but Bruce Anderson, and that they'd been traveling together for over a year. When Julia first shows up in the papers, she confirms his story, although she contests some of his details.
The first article that even brought her into light in a way, there was an affidavit printed. William C. Walters left Barnesville, North Carolina with my son Charles Bruce in February of 1912, saying that he only wanted to take the child with him for a few days on a visit to the home of his sister. I have not seen the child from that day to this. I did not give him the child. I merely consented for him to take my son for a few days. Walters had been at the home of his father, Mr. J.P. Walters, near Barnesville, since November 1911, and while he was there, he and the child were together a great deal and seemed very fond of each other. The boy would go anywhere with Walters. I would know my son if I were to see him, and I am sure he would know me. I have no picture of the child, but have a lock of his hair.
What was your reaction to that?
Her statement struck me as a very truthful statement. This woman was telling truth. She did have a son. And my heart hurts for Julia at this point, believing that this boy is her son. You know, it's really awkward because Leslie and Julia are in the same position. They're both missing children.
From May of 1913 on, Julia was all over the headlines. A New Orleans paper paid for her trip to Opelousas to see if she really could identify the boy as hers. The story, as was played out in the front pages, was this. Julia arrived, weary from an overnight train ride, and was taken into an Opelousas home. 5 boys around Bruce's age, including the child the Dunbars had claimed as Bobby, were brought in at different times, and Julia had to choose. When Bobby came in, he was in tears, and so was Julia. He showed no signs of recognition, even when she offered him an orange. But Julia asked the lawyers in the room if this was the child who was recovered. They refused to answer. Finally, she said she just didn't know, and the test was declared a failure. Julia begged for a second chance, and the next day she was allowed to see the boy again and undress him. This time, she felt more certain that it was her son. But her failure the night before was already national news. Julia had no lawyer and no money, and very few allies in Opelousas. So she left town and began the long trip back to North Carolina. And from that point on, the boy was Bobby Dunbar. The more Margaret learned about Julia Anderson's life, the more tragic the story seemed. Julia had 3 children by 2 different men, neither her husband, and she'd lost all her children in just a single year. A daughter she gave up for adoption, a baby whose sudden death she was wrongfully blamed for, and now Bruce. But the newspapers weren't very sympathetic. They implied she was a prostitute, called her illiterate and naive. Take this article in the New Orleans Item titled, "Julia Has Forgotten."
Animals don't forget, but this big, coarse country woman, several times a mother, she forgot. She cared little for her young. She hopes her son isn't dead, just as she hopes that the cotton crop will be good this year. See, I hate this article.
Then one day, Margaret found a Julia Anderson listed on an online genealogy site with this biographical note, quote, "Julia had a son from her first marriage named Bruce, who was kidnapped from North Carolina when he was 6 years old and taken to Louisiana. She tried to get him back, but the people that kidnapped him won him in court and changed his name to Bobby Dunbar."
Well, that was not what my grandmother told me. That was not right.
It was like an upside-down world opened up to Margaret, with a family who believed exactly the opposite of what her family believed. And in 2000, Margaret did what nobody else in her family, to her knowledge, had ever done before. She went to meet and visit with the descendants of Julia Anderson, her 2 living children, Hollis Rawls and Jewel Tarver, and Jewel's daughter, Linda.
My name is Linda Tarver, and I'm the daughter of Jewel Rawls Tarver, who is the daughter of Julia Anderson, and Julia Anderson would be my grandmother. All of us cousins grew up, we knew that we had an uncle that had been taken by the Dunbar family in Opelousas, Louisiana. We always said kidnapped. We said they kidnapped him.
From the Andersons, Margaret learned what happened to Julia after the controversy over Bobby Dunbar. Julia moved to Poplarville, Mississippi, 200 miles east of Opelousas, got married and had 7 children. Jewel and Hollis are the youngest, now in their 80s. Talking to Jewel and Hollis and Linda, a very different picture of Julia emerges than the one in the newspapers, of a barely literate woman of loose morals. Here's Linda.
Grandmother loved to read, and she used to read Zane Grey books. And then she would sit them around at night, and she would tell them the stories that she had read that day. But then when she became a Christian, she decided reading Zane Grey was the wrong thing to do. So they never got any more Zane Grey stories, but they had to listen to the Bible then.
We went to church. I'm telling you.
And you behaved too at church.
This is Jewel and Hollis, Julia's children.
And we'd walk through these woods, cross an old hickory log, across the creek, and go to church. And it'd be dinner time before we'd leave, and we'd starve to death before we got home.
Hollis and Jewel revere their mother. Julia didn't just go to church, they say. She founded the church. She was a nurse and a midwife for the entire community. During the Depression, she sewed all her children's clothes out of fertilizer bags, and they were always well fed. There was only one thing missing.
She always talked about Bruce, but she called him Bobby. She was always looking for him.
She never forgot it. Never, ever forgot the boy.
she'd always once in a while bring it up, and what the boy looked like, and she'd take a while to tell it, about he did so and this, that, and the other, and if it had been possible for her to got the child legally back or anything, she would have done it if possible. She would have. She loved the child. She loved Bruce. She sure did.
So, growing up, you knew that Bruce was out there.
We knew.
We knew we had a brother.
We knew we had a brother.
We
knew that.
We kept thinking, well, one day we'll get to go to this town and we'll find him. But we never did go.
Even though Opelousas is just 200 miles from Poplarville, they didn't have a lot of money back then, and that kind of travel was expensive. They told me that when Julia went back up to North Carolina for her mother's funeral, they had to sell the family mule to pay for the trip. But it wasn't just the cost, Hollis says.
Sort of, I reckon you'd be afraid, if you want to know the real word. I knew, according to the signs and things that they had in Opelousas, that the Dunbars were well-off people.
Dunbars everywhere.
Everywhere you look, there's a Dunbar sign on a building or something other. And people that has those signs up, I was always thought that you didn't mess with them.
And we figured if they took Mama's son, well, what kind of people were they to begin with?
And if people can do that through the laws and get away with it, who are we to try to do or interfere with something like that?
For all the new things Margaret learned about Julia Anderson's family, one of the most surprising revelations Jewel and Hollis offered was about Margaret's grandfather. As much as the Andersons wondered about Bobby, it seemed he'd been wondering about them as well. Hollis remembers a day in 1944, maybe, when he was in his late 20s. He was working at an ice plant in Poplarville, and a man he'd never seen before came in and started making small talk. Finally, he introduced himself. He was Bobby Dunbar from Opelousas, Louisiana. Hollis was startled, but before he could process it, a customer came in and Hollis had to rush off to work. When he came back, Bobby was still there. More small talk, and now a lot of looking each other over. But Hollis's work got in the way again, and eventually, Bobby left.
But 30 minutes after he left, it dawned on me what I had done. Here was a man that I've been looking for 20, almost 30, 20-something years anyhow. The mother's been telling me about, here he is looking me straight in the eye, and I didn't do nothing about trying to find out more about the situation. But I didn't. I just didn't. And I regret that.
Hollis' sister Jewel had a similar story. She was working at a service station that she and her husband ran at a crossroads outside Poplarville. A man came in and talked to her for maybe an hour, she says, just sat and drank coffee, looking only at her and asking all kinds of questions. But he didn't identify himself.
After he left then, and I got thinking about it, I said, that is who I believe he was. Bobby.
When Margaret heard this story during her first visit with Hollis and Jewel back in 2000, she had her doubts. But later, Margaret was visiting with her uncle and aunt, her father's siblings. And while they were in the car, Margaret was telling them about her research and the mysterious encounters that Hollis and Jewel remembered. In the rearview mirror, she saw her uncle and aunt exchange a charged look. Then they told her this story. Here's Margaret's uncle, Gerald, Bobby Dunbar's youngest son.
I was, it would have been 1963, so I'd have been 13 years old. Right. We were coming back from a trip, my brother's wedding in Ohio, in Cincinnati. And on the way back, we went through Mississippi. And I remember my dad saying, pointing, he says, those were the people that they came to pick me up from. And he asked, he said, should I stop? And my mother sort of responded, if you think you should. And so they did, we stopped. Then he went in and to the store. And so we stayed there for maybe 30 minutes or so. And he came back and we left.
Margaret, the granddaughter of Bobby Dunbar, and Linda, the granddaughter of Julia Anderson, interpreted this eerie coincidence differently. They'd been discussing Margaret's research on the phone and online since they first met. On the one hand, they were ideal research partners, since they both were singularly fascinated with the story. But on the other hand, it was an uneasy alliance. Here's Linda.
Margaret was totally convinced that it was Bobby Dunbar all along. I was totally convinced that it was Bruce Anderson all along.
We understood that we were both coming from different angles.
Again, Margaret.
But what was there to do but butt heads? You know, and yet we tried to do it very civilly for months.
Good morning to everyone, and we're certainly glad to have all of you with us.
Agreeing to disagree gets old fast. The differences between Margaret and Linda came to a head in Columbia, Mississippi, when Margaret was invited to share her research at the Historical Society in town. The sound you're hearing is from a video of the event. In the front of the room were Julia Anderson's children, Hollis and Jewel. Several times during her presentation, Margaret used phrases like this.
The illegitimate child of a domestic, Julia Anderson.
The illegitimate child of a domestic, Julia Anderson. Jewel and Hollis bristled. That was their mom she was talking about. Margaret went on to describe Julia like a character in a story, working in the fields with coarse hands and bare, dirty feet. And she made it clear that she didn't really believe the Anderson family's version of what happened, that Bobby was Bruce, but her own family's, that Bobby was Bobby, son of her great-grandparents, Percy and Leslie Dunbar. When Jewel and Hollis got home and told Linda what happened, she got mad.
I truly don't believe that when she spoke and the way she spoke, I don't believe that she meant to say it to be as derogatory as we took it either, if you want to know the truth. She had spoken the truth of Julia Anderson, had children out of wedlock. So she was a loose woman, which if you have to accept that, you have to accept it. But I wanted her to see it from my point of view. You know, I felt like she looked at it from her point of view long enough that it was my turn. And I don't remember if it was a written letter or email, but I told her, the very woman that you maligned at that meeting today could very well turn out to be your great-grandmother.
She said to me,
Again, Margaret.
You need to look a lot more closely. You keep wanting to know all about Julia. You need to look more into Leslie and Percy and judge their characters. And that did not make me happy. It sort of angered me to have her say that. But in retrospect, she was absolutely right. I did need to put down what I believed and be able to look at it with fresh eyes.
Coming up, what Margaret discovers, plus the kidnapper speaks. That's in a minute from Chicago Public Radio when our program continues.
The stories on This American Life have helped to shape life in America. There's no program quite like it, and it's here for you thanks to listener support. Thanks for yours, and please stay tuned for the next act, coming up in a moment here on 91.3 WLRN.
On last week's Wait Wait, Weird Al Yankovic talked about hiring actor Daniel Radcliffe to play him in a movie about his own life.
The first time I saw Harry Potter, I thought, someday that guy's got to play me.
On Peter Sagal this week, we go to Nashville to ask country music legend Brad Paisley what child actor he hopes will grow up to play him. Join us for the news quiz from NPR.
Coming up at 1 on 91.3 WLRN.
When you're on the go, there's no need to stop listening to WLRN. Download the WLRN mobile app, connect your phone to your car, and listen anytime, anywhere, in your car or out. The WLRN mobile app, available now for iPhone or Android.
This American Life, I'm Ira Glass. Our story unraveling the century-old mystery of what happened to Bobby Dunbar continues. Again, here's Tal McThenia.
By 2003, Margaret had been researching for 4 years. She'd taken all the articles from the scrapbook and all the articles from all the libraries and typed them, over 1,200 total. Margaret had maps and photo albums and tape recordings and books on her shelf like Social History of the American Alligator. That year, she started looking for descendants of William Walters, the wandering handyman, the man who'd kidnapped her grandfather. In 1914, Walters was convicted of kidnapping Bobby Dunbar. His lawyers appealed, and the state Supreme Court ordered a retrial. But incredibly, because the first trial cost the town so much money, prosecutors decided to drop the case instead. Walters was released. In 2003, Margaret opened up something called the Walters Family Genealogy Book. She pored over the names in the book and started making phone calls.
I'm Jean Cooper, and I'm the great-niece of William Cantwell Walters. We always called him Uncle Cant. I never knew he had William Cantwell until all this came up. He was always Uncle Cant.
We met with Jean and her sister Barbara in Savannah, Georgia. Just like Hollis and Jewel and Margaret, they'd grown up hearing the Bobby Dunbar story too. Only their version was a little racier.
Well, the story we heard was that this Miss Julia Anderson was a fine young lady, but most of fine young ladies get entrapped. And I tell you what, there's many a handsome young sweet-talking man come around and entrapped them. So that's what happened to Miss Julia as the story went. Now, I know it was rumored that Uncle Cant was the father and one of his brothers was the father. Could have been Uncle Bunt. He was a rounder. He was a real rounder. But they all denied it. They said it was another feller.
Jean and Barbara grew up on a farm in Georgia with their ailing grandfather Rad, William Walters' brother. After getting released from jail, William Walters had gone back to his life as a tinker, a traveling handyman, tuning pianos in people's parlors and fixing organs in country churches. And at least once or twice a year, his travels would bring him around to his brother's house for a visit.
Seeing Uncle Cant come with his wagon a-trinkling and a-bouncing, the pots and pans bouncing against each other, and you couldn't help but know it was Uncle Cant. But Grandpa would lighten up. Oh, he would just brighten up. There's Cant, there's Cant. Young'uns, put some more wood on the fire. Go to see what's in the kitchen. Fix him some supper. He'd always come about dark. Every time I remember him coming, it was about dark, wasn't it, Bobby? Yeah. Night. And it didn't matter if we'd already had supper in the fire, gone out in the stove. We had to light up the fire and cook Uncle Cant, fix Uncle Cant from some supper so he could sit with Grandpa till midnight. But each and every time he come, and he would come several times a year and stay a month at the time, and or 2 to 4 weeks, they sat and talked over the case of the kidnapping and how innocent he was. It was like it had just happened.
During one visit, Jean and Barbara's grandfather asked William Walters what he was doing traveling around the country with somebody else's boy in the first place. Walters explained that Julia was in dire straits and she couldn't take care of Bruce, and he was planning on bringing the boy back once she got on her feet. And also, there was the business element.
Uncle Cant told Grandpa that with that little boy...